The galaxy was ancient. Empires had risen and crumbled, species had ascended to greatness and faded into obscurity, and through it all there had been war. War was the only constant, the one unbroken truth that connected the countless civilizations scattered among the stars. But for all its violence, war was not always a thing of hopelessness. Sometimes it was a thing of necessity. When the distress signal first reached the Galactic Federation, it was ignored. The Khazar dominion was vast, proud, and powerful. Their fleets had once conquered entire sectors, bringing weaker species to their knees. The Khazar were warriors, tacticians, and masters of strategy. If they were begging for aid, then whatever force threatened them was not something anyone wanted to face. The Zelnari swarm had come like a storm. Their origin was unknown, their motives alien. There was no diplomacy, no communication, only the relentless hunger of their endless horde. They did not conquer, they consumed. They did not enslave, they assimilated. Planet after planet fell, reduced to barren husks, stripped of all organic matter. Entire populations were devoured, their biomass repurposed to fuel the swarm's endless expansion. Khazar Prime, the heart of the Dominion, was the last line of defense. The remaining fleets, battered and broken, had gathered in orbit, forming a desperate blockade. On the surface, the Khazar legions prepared for their final stand, their once mighty armies reduced to a fraction of their former strength. The swarm was relentless, pouring down from the skies in living waves, their monstrous forms blotting out the sun. The Khazar sent out their plea, broadcasting to every known power in the galaxy. Their message was simple: help us, or we all fall. Silence was their answer. The Galactic Federation could not risk its fleets. The Elvari trade syndicate had already withdrawn to protect their core systems. The Varax Imperium, once allies of the Khazar, sealed their borders and declared neutrality. No one would come. No one dared to. And then, when all hope seemed lost, a single reply came. Terran fleet en route, hold the line. The word sent a chill through the Khazar command chamber. Of all the species in the galaxy, the Terrans were the last they expected to answer their call. The last they would have ever wanted to. The Terrans were Deathworlders. Their homeworld, Earth, was a nightmare. A planet of raging storms, unpredictable climates, and an ecosystem where nearly every form of life was a predator. They had evolved in a crucible of suffering, forged by hardship, tempered by war. Every species in the Federation knew of them, feared them, and kept their distance. The Khazar had fought them once, centuries ago. It was a brief war, a small skirmish over disputed territory. The Khazar had been confident in their superiority, until the Terrans shattered their fleets in a campaign so brutal, so unrelenting, that it left even the hardened Khazar warriors shaken. The war had ended with no treaty, no negotiations, only silence, as the Terrans withdrew without a word, leaving behind ruins and the echoes of their wrath. And now they were coming again. The first Terran ships arrived within days. They did not send envoys. They did not ask for strategic briefings. They simply arrived. Khazar Prime was already burning when the fleet dropped out of FTL. The sky was choked with smoke, the horizon filled with the writhing masses of the swarm. The remaining Khazar ships were barely holding the orbital defense line, their forces dwindling with every passing hour. Then the void itself seemed to open. Terran warships emerged in formation, their hulls dark, battle-worn, and bristling with weaponry. They were unlike anything the Khazar had seen before, massive constructs of reinforced alloy, built not for elegance, but for destruction. Dreadnoughts the size of small moons took position, their broadside cannons locking onto the swarm. And then the bombardment began. The first salvo turned the night into day. The Terran fleet did not engage in careful maneuvers or precision strikes. They fired everything. Mass accelerators unleashed tungsten rods at near relativistic speeds, turning entire swarm formations into burning debris. Plasma lances carved through bioships like molten knives through flesh. Hypervelocity railguns shredded organic armor, their impact sending shockwaves through the void. The swarm tried to retaliate, launching their grotesque living torpedoes, spewing clouds of acid and spores designed to corrode metal and infect crew. It did not matter. The Terrans had seen worse. Their hulls were layered in ablative plating, their shields designed to absorb both energy and biological threats. The swarm's weapons, devastating to most fleets, barely slowed them down. Then came the landers. Unlike the Khazar, who had retreated into fortified positions, the Terrans did not seek shelter. They did not establish defensive lines. They dropped straight into the heart of the swarm. From orbit, thousands of reinforced drop pods rained down, slamming into the ground with bone-shattering force. As soon as they impacted, they burst open, unleashing armored shock troops in mechanized exosuits. The first wave hit the swarm like a tidal wave of fire and steel. Terran soldiers were unlike any warriors the Khazar had ever known. They did not fear the overwhelming numbers. They did not flinch at the monstrous horrors before them. They charged. Plasma rifles spat superheated death, cutting through chitin and muscle with surgical precision. Rotary cannons roared, sending streams of explosive rounds into the swarm's ranks. Some Terrans wielded massive flamethrowers, their weapons spewing liquid fire that clung to flesh and burned even in vacuum. And behind them, towering war machines, Titans, each one a walking fortress of destruction, armed with weapons designed for planetary siege. Some carried multi-barreled autocannons. Others wielded energy lances capable of vaporizing entire swarm clusters with a single shot. Their footfalls shook the ground, their presence a declaration of annihilation. The swarm hesitated. For the first time in their history, they encountered something that did not run, did not break, did not succumb to their overwhelming numbers. For the first time, they faced an enemy more monstrous than themselves. The battle raged for hours. The swarm threw everything they had at the Terrans. Wave after wave of bio-horrors, massive leviathans that could crush entire buildings, airborne monstrosities that blotted out the sky. The Terrans did not falter. And then, the killing began in earnest. From the last stronghold of the Khazar, High Chancellor Velnar watched, his mandibles clicking in disbelief. He had prepared himself for a last stand, for the inevitable fall of his people. He had steeled himself for death. Instead, he witnessed a slaughter. The swarm was not being pushed back. They were being exterminated. The holographic displays in the war chamber flickered, showing live battlefield feeds. Entire swarm clusters were vanishing beneath the relentless assault. Khazar Prime, once on the brink of collapse, was becoming a graveyard. Then, the chamber's comms crackled, and a new transmission appeared. A Terran. His armor was black, worn from battle, the insignia of his rank barely visible beneath the dried blood. A scar ran down the side of his face, his expression unreadable. But it was his smile that froze Velnar in place. A Terran's smile in the middle of battle was not an expression of relief. It was not joy. It was hunger. "High Chancellor Velnar," the Terran said, his voice rough, edged with amusement. "I hear you needed some help." Velnar swallowed hard. His warriors had fought for days, struggling against the tide. The Terrans had been here for mere hours, and they were winning. "You came," Velnar managed, his voice almost a whisper. "The swarm was unstoppable. We had no hope." The Terran laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "Hope?" He shook his head. "You don't need hope." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming, his smile widening. "You need killers." And outside, beneath the burning sky, the Deathworlders roared, and the extermination truly began. The battlefield was a nightmare of fire and blood, a vision of chaos so complete that even the most hardened Khazar warriors could not comprehend it. The swarm, once an unstoppable tide, now recoiled in confusion and pain. Their bodies, vast and endless, piled in writhing heaps as Terran forces cut through them with brutal efficiency. The sky burned with orbital fire. From the dreadnoughts above, great beams of concentrated energy lanced down, carving deep wounds into the planet's surface. The bombardment was relentless, precise, and merciless. Each strike targeted the largest concentrations of the swarm, turning vast breeding pits into nothing more than scorched craters. Yet even this devastation was nothing compared to the carnage unfolding on the ground. The Terrans fought like demons, their armored figures moving through the battlefield with a grace that belied their monstrous strength. They did not march in formation as the Khazar did. They did not rely on the safety of trenches or barricades. They moved like a living tide of death, each soldier an engine of destruction, fighting in unison but with the independence of seasoned hunters. One by one, the swarm's greatest beasts fell. A titan strode through the carnage, its heavy footfall shaking the ground. Its rotary cannon spat high-caliber rounds, punching through the thickest of chitin, tearing apart even the most heavily armored monstrosities. A winged horror the size of a city transport shrieked as it descended, razor limbs slicing through the air. The titan turned, its weapons locking on, and a single blast from its plasma lance reduced the creature to molten slag. In the ruins of what had once been a Khazar fortress, a swarm of lesser bioforms, each the size of a Khazar warrior, rushed forward. Their many limbs churned up the ground, their mandibles snapping hungrily. A squad of Terran soldiers met them head-on. The first Terran raised his weapon, a massive scattergun designed for close-quarters devastation. He fired once, and an entire row of the creatures disappeared in a spray of burning flesh. The second Terran, smaller but faster, wielded twin plasma blades, darting through the enemy ranks with inhuman agility. He moved like a specter, his blades slicing through carapace and bone, each strike lethal, each motion practiced and precise. A third soldier, wounded, dragged himself to his feet. His left arm was missing, torn away by one of the swarm's larger brutes, but even as the ichor dripped from his armor, he did not hesitate. He ripped the pin from a grenade with his teeth and lunged forward, plunging it into the gaping maw of a charging bioform before detonating it in a burst of shrapnel and fire. The Khazar watched in stunned silence from their last stronghold. They had believed the Terrans to be savages, unpredictable beasts of war. They had thought them reckless, chaotic, undisciplined. But this was not the battle rage of primitive warriors. This was something else entirely. The Terrans fought with a purpose. Each move was calculated, each action had weight. They were not berserkers. They were butchers. The swarm did not understand fear, not in the way most species did. They did not retreat in the face of death, nor did they flinch when their kind was slaughtered en masse. But something deep within them, some primal instinct buried within their genetic code, began to whisper a warning. Flee. The first sign of weakness appeared when the lesser bioforms began to slow their assault. Then the larger ones, the beasts that had once rampaged across the battlefield with unstoppable force, hesitated. They had never encountered an enemy they could not overwhelm. And then the impossible happened. The swarm broke. The Terrans did not allow them to retreat. A new order came from the fleet above. No mercy, no survivors. Dreadnoughts repositioned, aiming their heavy cannons at the remaining swarm clusters. The Titans pushed forward, crushing the retreating creatures beneath their massive frames. Strike teams moved with precision, cutting off escape routes, ensuring no enemy slipped away. In the command chamber of the Khazar's stronghold, High Chancellor Velnar could do nothing but watch. The holographic display before him painted a picture of total annihilation. The swarm, which had once seemed limitless, was now little more than scattered remnants, desperately seeking shelter where none existed. The transmission from the Terran fleet remained open. The same soldier who had spoken to him before was still there, still watching the destruction unfold. His scarred face had not changed, but there was something in his expression, something dark, something ancient. The Khazar had fought wars for centuries. They had crushed rebellions, conquered planets, wiped out entire species in the name of their dominion. They had thought themselves warriors, masters of battle. But now, watching the Terrans work, Velna realized the truth. The Khazar had never fought a real war. Not like this. The transmission crackled, and the Terran's voice came through once more. "You see now, don't you?" Velnar's mandibles twitched, but he found himself unable to speak. "You thought you knew war," the Terran continued. "You thought you understood what it meant to fight. But war isn't about honor. It's not about tactics or strategy or codes of conduct." The display flickered as a titan stomped down, its massive foot crushing a wounded swarm bioform beneath it. "War is about winning." Velnar finally found his voice. "The swarm is finished." The Terran chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Not yet." Velnar frowned. "They are routed, their forces shattered. What more is there to—" "They still exist," the Terran interrupted. "Somewhere out there, beyond this battlefield, their kind still thrives. They will regroup, they will multiply, and they will come back." Velnar hesitated. "Then we must rebuild. Prepare for their return." The Terran shook his head. "No." Velnar's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, no?" The Terran's smile widened. "You rebuild when the war is over. This war isn't over." Velnar felt a deep unease settle over him. "Then what do you propose?" The Terran's gaze darkened. "We follow them. We trace them back to their breeding worlds, to their hives, to their nests." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming like a predator about to pounce. "And we burn every last one of them." Velnar recoiled slightly. "That is genocide." The Terran shrugged. "Call it whatever you want." Velnar's mandibles clicked together in apprehension. He had known war. He had seen countless battles, issued orders that led to the deaths of millions. But even he could not comprehend the scale of destruction the Terrans were proposing. "This," he hesitated, searching for the right words. "This is more than war." The Terran nodded. "You're right." Velnar exhaled slowly, relieved that perhaps the humans saw reason after all. But then the Terran spoke again. "This is extermination." And outside, across the ruined remains of Khazar Prime, the Deathworlders prepared for the next phase of the war. The fires of Khazar Prime still burned, a fitting monument to the battle that had taken place. The swarm was dead on this world, but the war was far from over. Across the ruined cities, the last of the Khazar warriors moved cautiously, stepping over broken bodies and shattered carapaces, their senses overwhelmed by the scent of burned flesh and plasma-scorched metal. They had fought with all their strength, and yet it was not their victory. It had never been their victory. It belonged to the Terrans. The humans did not celebrate. They did not pause to mourn their dead. They did not gather in halls of honor to recount their battle as the Khazar did. Instead, they worked. Even as the last shots echoed into the distance, even as the swarm's final remnants were crushed beneath their boots, they moved with ruthless efficiency, setting up command posts, analyzing data, gathering intelligence. The Khazar could hardly believe what they were seeing. There was no exhaustion in the Deathworlders, no relief that the battle was over. If anything, they seemed restless, as though this had only been the beginning. Velnar stood at the entrance to the last remaining war chamber, watching as the lead Terran commander approached. His armor, dented and scorched, carried the marks of battle, yet the man moved with the same deadly confidence he had before. The Khazar High Chancellor had fought many wars, had spoken with leaders and warriors from across the stars, but none unsettled him the way this man did. The Terran stopped before him, his gaze sweeping across the broken city. His lips curled just slightly. "You fought hard," he said finally. Velnar wasn't sure if it was a compliment or an observation. "We held as long as we could." The Terran nodded. "And now you see why. That was never going to be enough." Velnar bristled. The Khazar were proud warriors, forged through centuries of battle. To hear this human speak of their efforts as if they had been futile was an insult, yet he could not deny the truth of it. He looked again at the bodies, Khazar and swarm alike, tangled in death. His people had fought, had bled, had died, and yet the final blow had not come from their hands. "You intend to take the fight to them," he said. It was not a question. The Terran commander turned his gaze to the sky, where the Deathworlder fleet still hung like a storm waiting to break. "We don't leave wars half-finished." Velnar's mandibles clicked together in frustration. "And what if they are already beaten? What if this battle broke them? The swarm has never known defeat before. Perhaps this is enough." The Terran laughed, low and humorless. "You think like a man who has never fought an enemy that doesn't fear death." He gestured to the battlefield. "You saw it, didn't you? Even when they started to break, even when their instincts screamed at them to run, they still fought. The swarm doesn't stop. It doesn't surrender. If even one of them survived this battle, they will find a way to rebuild, and when they do, they will come back stronger." Velnar wanted to argue, but deep down he knew the human was right. The Khazar had studied the swarm for decades, trying to understand its nature, and if there was one truth they had discovered, it was that the swarm never truly died. As long as a single hive remained, as long as there was organic matter to consume, they would grow again. The human's voice was quieter now, almost thoughtful. "We know they're kind. We've fought creatures like them before. The only way to win a war against something like the swarm is to wipe them out completely. Every world, every hive, every last one." Velnar's stomach twisted. "You mean to commit genocide?" The Terran turned to face him fully, his eyes cold and unyielding. "You think that word makes a difference?" His voice was sharp now, the quiet patience gone. "What do you think they were going to do to you, to your people, to your worlds? If we hadn't come, if you had lost, what would be left of the Khazar dominion? Would you even exist?" Velnar had no answer. The human took a step closer. "The difference between us and them is that we understand what must be done. We don't hesitate. We don't let morality cloud survival. You hesitate, High Chancellor, and that's why you were losing." Velnar's claws clenched at his sides. "And you? You feel nothing when you do this? When you burn entire species from the galaxy?" The Terran's expression didn't change. "We feel plenty. We just don't let it stop us." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fires crackled around them, the distant sounds of Terran machinery humming as they prepared. For the next phase of their campaign, the Khazar warriors who had survived stood nearby, their bodies exhausted, their minds reeling from what they had witnessed. They had never seen war waged like this before, so absolute, so methodical. There was no honor in it, no ceremony, only destruction. Velnar turned his gaze toward the sky where the shattered remains of swarm bioships still drifted, their broken husks a testament to the Terran fleet's power. It was a power that terrified him. The Khazar had been a mighty force in the galaxy, feared and respected, but now he understood that there were beings far worse than them. The Terrans were not just soldiers, they were executioners. The human commander must have sensed his hesitation because his voice softened just slightly. "You don't have to like it," he said. "You just have to understand that it needs to be done." Velnar exhaled, the weight of his people's survival pressing down on him. He had spent his entire life believing in the strength of the Khazar dominion, believing that they were the apex warriors of the galaxy. But they had been wrong. "Where do we strike first?" he asked. The Terran's smile was grim. "We traced their signal before we arrived. We know where their breeding worlds are. We know where their queens are hiding." He lifted his wrist, activating a holographic display. The projection flickered to life, showing a map of the nearby sectors. 4 systems glowed red, each marked with Terran targeting indicators. "We hit them hard. We don't give them time to adapt. We burn them down before they can scatter." His eyes flicked to Velnar. "We're not asking for permission. The Terran fleet moves with or without you." Vellner studied the map, his mind racing. He should have been disgusted, should have rejected the sheer brutality of the Terrans' plan. But deep down, beneath the layers of Khazar pride and warrior's honor, there was something else. Relief. For so long, his people had fought for survival, always one step away from annihilation. The Khazar had been prepared to die, to be wiped from existence, to be remembered only as another casualty of the swarm's endless hunger. But now, for the first time, there was a path forward. A way to ensure that they never had to fear the swarm again. Slowly, he turned to face the Terran commander. "We will fight alongside you." The human nodded as if he had already known the answer. 2 days later, the fleets moved. Khazar Prime had barely begun to recover from the devastation, but there was no time to rebuild. The Khazar dominion had been broken, its people scattered, its armies in ruins. But the survivors, those who had fought alongside the Terrans, had changed. They had seen what true war looked like, had witnessed firsthand the difference between merely fighting to survive and waging war to win. The swarm had left them no choice. Now, they would leave the swarm no chance. The first assault came at the edges of the known system, striking a minor swarm nest on an isolated world. The Khazar had expected a difficult fight, but when the Terran fleet opened fire, they understood just how little they had known about the humans. The swarm didn't even have time to react. The orbital bombardment lasted less than an hour, reducing the entire surface to molten rock. No ground forces were deployed. No engagements were necessary. The Terrans had no interest in risking lives when they could simply erase the enemy from existence. Vellner watched from the bridge of his ship, surrounded by his remaining generals. His mandibles twitched in disbelief. "That was a world," he muttered. "An entire world gone in minutes." The Terran commander stood beside him, arms crossed. "That was a nest," he corrected. "Not a world, not anymore." Vellner said nothing. The next target was not so easily destroyed. It was a larger breeding world, one of the primary hives. The swarm had fortified it, covering its surface with living defenses, massive bioturrets, and underground tunnels where their queens spawned endless waves of horrors. This time, the battle would require more than just orbital fire. The landing zones were chosen carefully, striking at the weak points in the swarm's outer defenses. The first wave consisted of mechanized dropships, delivering Titan war machines to the surface, their massive frames shaking the ground as they deployed. Behind them, Khazar warriors clad in newly reinforced armor moved with precision alongside their Terran counterparts. Vellner had expected to see hesitation in his people, doubt about their new allies and the methods they employed, but as the battle began, he saw something else. Adaptation. The Khazar had always prided themselves on their discipline in battle, their rigid formations and tactical doctrines, but against the swarm, those tactics had failed. Now they fought differently.